has been a lovely experience. I've got to thank Matthias and the Field Institute in general for inviting me here first of all, and then making it possible to have this joint discussion with Stephanie and Scott, because there's been, though we've both been in the same overall basis School of Economic Thought, we've both approached this issue of how do you build a monetary macroeconomics from slightly different angles. And we really have to get them together to make an overall collated theory, and I think we've done a lot of that in the last couple of days. And where we do have differences, most of the time, it's a difference, exactly the same phenomenon, viewed from a slightly different angle. So that's been a very good outcome of the last couple of days. So if you look at the two schools, they're both approaches to building a monetary model of capitalism, where we argue banks, money and debt are essential. And also, of course, knowing how the public sector creates money as well. So I've been through a bit of this last week. I'm repeating a bit, mainly for the sake of a better recording on the web. So pardon me if you've been through this last week, you're getting a bit of reinforcement today. And the focus of the MMT has been on the vertical money creation, of the way the government sector creates money. What I've done, and mainly working with Michael Hudson and Dirk Bessemer, as well as a few other people around the world, is what one of my colleagues titled monetary circuit theory, and that is really looking at how the private sector creates money. Of course, we're living in a mixed system where both are done, so we have to actually finally get it together. We're doing it from a heritage which starts most recently from Minsky, but goes back through Schumpeter and Keynes and a whole range of people who are not neoclassical economists. And there's variation in what we focus upon where we come from in that literature. There's a strong, as you mentioned, Scott, Ada Lerner and the functional finance, Wynne Godley and the social accounting matrix, a strong part of MMT. Where I've come from has been a lot more Graziani, which is the circuit theory coming out of Europe that tries to explain why money has to be a non-commodity, and Richard Goodwin's model of cyclical dynamics, which bring me into the chaos area. That's how Matthias and I met. Now, so we're examining the same phenomenon, which is a monetary production economy, from two different perspectives, which are very closely related to each other. Unlike the neoclassicals, who ignore it completely. And of course, I can't resist. I've got this perfect quote from our beginning. You're going to see this quote so many times from us, because this is manna from heaven for non-neoclassical economists, to make it clear to people who actually can think like mathematicians. Yes, economists believe they can model the economy without debt, banks and money. One thing which Krugman has done is try to bring debt and leverage. So he says, why do banks matter to a story about debt and leverage? Well, thank you very much, Paul, for making it clear that that's actually what most neoclassical economists believe, because he's at the fringe, advancing the theory to actually try to account for why debt matters. Now, where we're looking at the real world and trying to explain what actually happens in this world where there's both private and public debt creation. So rather than saying there is no elephant in the living room, or there are no wings on the bird, which is the analogy I prefer, we're saying what does it look like? And there had been, because we've started looking at the banking system and how that creates money, the other looking at the government system and how that creates money, we haven't really brought the two together well as yet. So there's some different conclusions standing up there. And it's rather like this wonderful old fable of the elephant and the living room. And now I've got this blind man and the elephant here, 6 blind men examining the elephant. So I didn't have this properly stored last time round, and I've just realised, pardon me, I'm going to stop here. I normally do a screen recording and I simply forgot to start the software, so just give me a second to start that. I want to record this whole thing as a screen animation as well as recording on the video there. Hang on a second, I know it's going to happen here. I'll choose record. I'll change it to full screen and record sound. It will do neither. Notice it's full screen. I can stop the bloody thing. You know the old story, this is going to go down well, a web to where a human to really fuck up takes a computer?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay. So discard that once. Okay, stop that, back there again. Stop. Stop, I say. Back over here. Okay, now I go for full screen record sound. Now it will do it. Bingo. Okay. Right. Now it's ready. Okay, and I've got to turn my sound on as well. It was really good. You've got the blind man and the elephant being narrated by the deaf man. Okay, here we go.
The each by observation might satisfy his mind. The first approached the elephant, and happening to fall against his broad and sturdy side, at once began to bawl, "God bless me, but the elephant is very like a wall." The second, feeling of the tusk, cried, "Oh, what have we here, so very round and smooth and sharp? To me 'tis mighty clear, this wonder of the elephant is very like a spear." The third approached the animal, and happening to take the squirming trunk within his hands, thus boldly up and spake, "I see," quoth he, "the elephant is very like a snake." The fourth reached out an eager hand and felt about the knee. "What most this wondrous beast is like is mighty plain," quoth he. "'Tis clear enough the elephant is very like a tree." The fifth, who chanced to touch the ear, said, "E'en the blindest man can tell what this resembles most. Deny the fact who can. This marvel of an elephant is very like a fan." The sixth no sooner had begun about the beast to grope, than seizing on the swinging tail that fell within his scope, "I see," quoth he, "the elephant is very like a rope." And so these men of Hindustan disputed loud and long, each in his own opinion exceeding stiff and strong, though each was partly in the right, and all were in the wrong. The moral: so oft in theologic wars, the disputants, I mean, rail on in utter ignorance of what each other mean, and prate about an elephant not one of them has seen.
Beautiful piece of work, that, about fine and later animation.
It's nice to remember what a record sounds like, too.
So what I've done here is take one point at which there is something we still need to get resolved. I think we resolved that in the last couple of days, which is a great feeling. And that's an argument you'll find in some modern monetary theory texts to say that spending by the private sector is normally less than income. This is one from Bill Mitchell, where he said the non-government sector typically decides in the aggregate to spend less than the total income flowing to it. And that means that therefore the flow of spending is less than the income produced, in which case unless the government steps in there'll be insufficient aggregate demand. That's one argument for why you need government deficit spending. But if you read Schumpeter and Minsky, they argue quite a different proposition to say that normally spending is greater than income. So what Schumpeter said, what he called the money you make out of selling goods and services now total credit, fully covered credit. It must be more than just fully covered credit financing spending for the economy to grow. And Minsky argues that for the economy to grow, current spending plans have to be greater than received income, and therefore part of spending is financed by going into debt. So we've got those two propositions. We can resolve it, and we have resolved it, but neoclassicals can't resolve it. So I'm going to divert now and say why they can't. And here we go back to Paul again, quoting me and the paper that I wrote, which I gave at the INET conference that he was going to attend and then had family reason not to be able to. He's saying, what I'm asserting, lending somehow is in addition to aggregate demand. I don't get that at all. I like the way he writes. I do, actually. Quite enjoy it.
Very honest.
Yeah. And comparing to bloody Brad smirking blonde, oh my God. Paul's much more down to earth. So if I decide to cut back on my spending and put the funds in the bank and the bank lends that out to somebody else, there's no increase in demand. He says maybe, because of a person who's got a higher propensity to spend borrows from a lower, that'll make a bit of a difference. But I'm saying something completely different, and he's not quite sure what it is. And he says something about the notion about creating money equals creating demand, but then that isn't right in any model I understand. That doesn't mean it isn't necessarily right. Okay. Well, let's just take a look at what his argument is. What he does understand, his model as to why we're in a crisis now and it won't go away, is the liquidity trap. And this comes from Hicks's ISLM model. The because Hicks's attempt to, it wasn't an attempt to interpret Keynes. If you read Hicks writing in 1981, he admits he had this model made up in 1935 before he read Keynes. He says it quite explicitly. But he argued, he used his model and he portrayed his model as an interpretation of Keynes. And you've got an area where if you, I'll bring up the diagram in a second, go back to the graphics in a moment, that's wrongly sequenced. There's what we call the LM curve representing what happens in the money market, the IS curve representing what happens in the goods market, and if you're in the region where I've drawn the IS curve intersecting with the LM curve, if you try to boost the money supply, you can't do anything because you're stuck on that low curve there. If you boost the curve out, rather here, if you can move that curve, then you're going to increase output. Okay? That's the basic idea of it. You're at a point where you can't push interest rates down any lower, and therefore at that point, if you try to use monetary policy to stimulate the economy, you're trying to move it along here, but the arrow went up. It's because it's horizontal there, you'll have no effect from monetary policy, but fiscal policy, by shifting that curve out, will cause economic growth. Now, I have no time at all for that sort of vision of the world, but let's take a look at it carefully and see what he has to say. So he says, again, this comes back to the point that Scott made earlier, that so far as the conventional neoclassical economists are concerned, monetary policy matters, fiscal policy doesn't. So he's saying for the last 50 years, the Federal Reserve has ended recessions. And it's ended the recessions because it controls the monetary base, and that then feeds through money multiplier to the level of money in the economy. But he says this time around they've tripled the monetary base, but nothing has happened. So, well, what they're doing is by pushing cash into the banks, they're pushing interest rates down. But they can't push them below zero. They're what they call the zero lower bound. If zero is not low enough, because what you're trying to do is to, people in debt are spending less, you want people who don't have debt to spend more, but because they've got a low preference for goods now, you've got to really encourage them to get the money out of the bank and spend it. Okay? And you've got to drive the rates down really, really low, and you can't drive it below zero. That's the liquidity trap. It's what happens when zero, as a nominal rate of interest, isn't low enough. Now, the crisis according to Paul, that we have a period of too much optimism about debt. So debtors decided to borrow too much and spend too much. And that meant creditors had to be encouraged to lend more by increasing real interest rates. And then people remembered how bad debt really was. And they moved from leveraging up to leveraging down. But that isn't symmetric because you can't make the real rates low enough to encourage people who are conservative and want to save to actually spend. You've got to make it so unattractive to save money that they actually go out there and buy those Rolex watches rather than leaving the money sitting in a bank. So he said what's actually happening is we're in a depression because debtors are trying to delever too quickly because their reduction in spending is not matched by an increase in spending by people who are creditors. That's the whole analysis. So therefore what fiscal policy is about is not stopping the deleveraging but slowing it down so that it occurs at such a pace that you get symmetric behaviour by lenders and borrowers. Remember, lenders and borrowers are not banks, but they don't exist, or they don't matter, but all these intermediaries. So, like I'm a lender, Scott needs to get a cab fare, so, you owe me this, Scott, okay, and I therefore can't spend that money, okay, but to actually encourage me to spend the money, if the interest rates drop, it's got to be so unattractive for me to leave that on the table that I go and buy the cab out to the airport instead. That's the sort of logic. Okay. Now there's two testable hypotheses here, and this is Mathias's suggestion about how to take a look and see, let's work from empirical data, let's be really radical as economists, go and actually check the data first. Okay. One of them is that high interest rates will be correlated with high rates of regrowth of debt. Otherwise you can't encourage, you've got to increase the supply of loanable funds by making the rates high enough that people actually supply additional money for lending. And the change in debt doesn't matter except when you're in a liquidity trap, because then you get the asymmetric effect between debtors reducing their spending too much and you can't encourage savers to spend more, so only after you hit the zero lower bound should you have any real relationship between the change in debt and macroeconomic activity. So let's take a look at real interest rates and the real debt growth first of all. That's the federal funds rate, which is the red line, and the blue is the inflation rate. You can see they're both trending down over time. Deflation for a while after the crisis first hit. You went from +5 to -2. So you can then work out your real rate of interest from that. And what I'm marking, the boundary where, according to Paul, there should be rather an impact of debt is where that zero lower bound comes to operation. That's 2009 when the Fed cut the reserve rate from 1% to 1/8 of 1%, virtually zero, so close it's not funny anymore. So what that's telling us is that there should be, throughout the whole period now, what he's arguing, there should be some relationship between real interest rates and the real rate of growth of debt. And I'll put this on the wrong chart. I'm pissed off with myself here, just realise this, because when you take a look at the correlation between the real change in debt and the real interest rate, it ends up being 0.46, which is not bad, okay. But it's actually highest after the zero lower bound, which is weird, because he wasn't talking about that period, he's talking about beforehand, encouraging. You're saying monetary policy is ineffective, but most of the correlation is coming out of the period after you get the zero lower bound. Before the zero lower bound, the correlation between, this is not shown on the chart is the wrong chart, my apologies. I'll just change that on the slides and try to put them up on the web. The correlation between real interest rates and the real rate of growth of debt before zero lower bound was 0.2. Now you're not going to write home about a correlation at that level. That's a fairly weak correlation.
Why don't you go back and say so? Maybe
Okay. Now what I'm doing now is taking a look at the second hypothesis, which is that change in debt only has an impact on the economy after you're in a liquidity trap. So before, there should be no correlation between change in debt, the level of real debt, change in nominal debt deflated by the CPI. There should be no correlation at all between that and macroeconomic variables, like, for example, the unemployment rate. Now, you know I'm talking through Paul Krugman's hat right now, because any blind Freddy could tell, even one of the 6 men from Hindustan could tell, that there's a correlation. But taking a look at that, his hypothesis was there should be a strong correlation after the zero lower bound hit, but no correlation beforehand. Well, correlation after the zero lower bound, there's a negative correlation between real change in debt and unemployment. You would expect a negative correlation. Minus 0.27. Not going to write home about that. Beforehand, across the entire period, minus 0.55. So the correlation is weakest when he had said it's only going to exist. And in fact, when he said there's going to be no correlation, it's minus 0.69. So I think I can empirically chuck that argument out the window. The liquidity trap does not explain why debt matters, because debt clearly matters across the entire time period. Now, I'm calling it the liquidity claptrap now because it's more appropriate. Like a lot of neoclassical theory, it's neat, plausible, and empirically wrong. So we need to now say, well, obviously debt does matter through the whole period, not just after the zero lower bound strikes. And actually matters least after the zero lower bound, which is quite fascinating. So we need an alternative hypothesis, which I effectively derived empirically, looking at the data and trying to make sense of the whole thing. And that is that aggregate demand matters at all times because it adds to income, it adds to spending. Change in debt adds to the level of spending in the economy. And I've got to somehow there because I'm going to explain that later. And it's partially confirmed by that later. The correlation I showed you across the entire period of minus 0.55 between real changes in debt and the change in the level of unemployment. But to properly measure it, what I have to do as well is look not at the real percentage change in debt, but change in debt as a percentage of GDP. The argument is going that the change in debt adds to aggregate demand. Now, if you go back to the 1970s, when the debt to GDP ratio was 100%, then a 10% change in the level of debt was a 10% addition to GDP. Come forward to 2009, that 10% change in debt is a 30% addition to demand above GDP because debt is three times as high, 300% of GDP now, versus 100% back in the 1970s. So to illustrate that, this is the right chart. There's the black line is the private debt to GDP ratio for the last pretty much century, plotted on the right-hand axis, so you can see it peaked at just over 300% back in 2009, and was down at 50% roughly, 45% back in 1945. So when you hit 100%, which is about here, a percentage change in the level of debt was exactly the same percentage of GDP. But you fast forward as debt levels rise, and a 10% change in the level of debt in real terms is a 30% change measured by GDP. So I then go through and take exactly the same data, but rather than dividing change of debt by just subtracting CPI change from debt change, I'm now dividing change in debt by the GDP and correlating that against unemployment. And the correlations there, after the zero lower bound, minus 0.63. Better than anything that Paul gets out of his hypothesis. Across the entire period, minus 0.76. And before the zero lower bound, minus 0.84. Empirically, the hypothesis that changes in debt do matter wins hands down. So the question is, what's actually going on there? Well, let's just take a look at this is the correlations overall as well. Let's look at the real interest rate argument, which he's got weak confirmation for. His arguments about change in real private debt and unemployment, which are the wrong way around for his argument, and mine, which come out very, very strongly in favour of the hypothesis that aggregate change in debt matters. So the mechanism of the...
How is the correlation distributed?
Distributed?
Yeah, that can be a good number, but I'm just wondering what's the sort of significance interval for that?
Difference interval?
Like the significance interval.
I haven't actually calculated that. That would be, Matthias, you want to have a crack at that one?
Sure.
Okay. I don't have I use MathCAD for most of my work and it's built on correlation. Actually, I use their correlation coefficient. They don't give significance intervals and so on, unfortunately. MATLAB, that would be a breeze. I'll pass the data to you and you can let me know.
A D2 can do.
Pardon?
A D2 can do.
There you go. Okay. So change in debt, private debt, finances investment in excess of retained earnings and speculation in excess of distributed profits. That's where the debt kicks in. And the change in government debt finances the government deficit with a caveat or two over the original case we looked at. Yeah.
The change in debt, how have you defined this change in debt? It's the government debt or the debt to the private sector by the banking sector?
It's change in debt.
So,
Private sector, yeah.
Private sector debt over a time period divided by GDP at that time period.
So it's the credit given to the private sector?
It's
a domestic credit given to the private sector?
Domestic private debt.
I guess Aditya is asking, does it include debt from bank to bank, or is it just from the bank sector?
The banking sector to it's the debt of the rest of the economy to the banking sector. Yeah, so it's the debt of households, non-bank financial institutions, and the non-bank commercial sector.
So it's bank loans, basically.
Yeah, basically bank loans. Yeah, it's on the flow of funds table L1.
It's in FRED too.
Yeah. So what I'm going to go now is the logical argument as to why change in debt answers those various sources of demand. Anybody here last week would have seen this, you're getting it again. So Scott's been through it a few times as well. So you can find income as being wages plus profits. I'm going to start by assuming that all wages are consumed, and I'm going to divide profits into distributed profits, which the firm sector hands over to the shareholders and they then spend and consumed, and retained profits, which the firm invests. So I can then say that income can be broken down into wages plus distributed profits plus retained earnings. Expenditure is going to be money spent buying either consumer goods or capital goods. I'm leaving out the asset market here and I'm leaving out the government sector as well. So your consumer spending is going to be equal to wages plus distributed profits. Your investment spending, on the other hand, is going to have two sources. One is retained earnings and the other is new debt. You can finance either by, I covered this in more detail last week, either by borrowing money or by using retained earnings. So you can say spending on investment goods is going to be equal to retained earnings plus the change in debt. Now, unlike Krugman, I'm not going to cancel out and say change in debt is zero. It's now lending from a bank to a non-bank. It's creating money and creating demand. Let's put those two equations together. There's the flow of income over time. There's the flow of expenditure, where I can now substitute wages plus distributed profits for C, and retained earnings plus change in debt for I. Therefore, I've got that expression for total expenditure. And if I now subtract income from expenditure, what I find first of all, the W's cancel, the distributed profits cancel, and the retained earnings cancel, and the gap is the change in debt. That's why you can say expenditure is greater than income. Less than income, of course, when people are deleveraging, which is the problem we're going through right now. So you rearrange that and say expenditure is income plus change in debt, which is something I've been trying to communicate to a number of people. We've finally got it right with ourselves, which is great. I've got to put this mark avoid at some stage now. Hopefully, once you can see this, it won't be too hard.
I have to clarify what debt we're talking
Yeah,
about.
that's a whole use, because obviously I'm confusing people by using what look like the ex post identities from the accounting tables. I'm not. I'm talking about flow over time.
And they think, like the question back here,
Yeah.
that you may be talking about all those types of debt.
Yeah.
So it's the particular debt that you're talking about.
Yeah. So I see this as a necessary consequence of believing the money, knowing the economy, the money supply is endogenous, created by the banking sector through the lending process. And when that finances investment, then you're going to have total spending in the economy being sum of incomes earned through what Schumpeter called the circular flow, plus new debt, new loans taken out to finance investment. Now, that does it without sacrificing the spending power of any savers, so it's not being deducted from current saving, from what savers can do. So you're going to find normally, as Minsky argued, that the current spending plans will be greater than current received income. It's quite a straightforward consequence, a necessary consequence of saying the money supply is endogenous, but of course it'll go into reverse when you do leveraging. And that turns up very strongly in the empirical data as well. So I think some of the confusion that economists have had about this comes from the practice of modelling what they call discrete time, or they tend to call them periods. They're not actually as aware as mathematicians would be talking about discrete versus continuous time modelling. And unfortunately, a lot of the difficulty they have with doing dynamics comes out of that discrete time framework, because they don't really know the mathematics of discrete time to begin with, because they're not trained by mathematicians. They're trained by economists, and that really stuffs things up. So mathematicians, please take over teaching maths to economists. So that's an important element of, I think, how people to finally cope with this insight.
And forget that they confuse ex ante and ex post.
Yeah, that's right, ex ante and ex post as well. They say that what you've recorded after the event, and they get that caught up with what's actually causing the process over time, which is another major source of problems. Now, I'm looking at the asset market. So my A now here is expenditure on assets, as well as consumption goods and investment goods. And presuming, for simplicity here, that capitalists are the only ones who speculate, they're going to have two sources of funds from speculating. They can speculate with part of distributed profits they don't consume, and they can also borrow money. So debt is now broken down into debt to buy capital goods and debt to speculate with. So total speculation is going to equal the profits that are used for speculation, distributed profits, part of them, and the change in debt taken on for speculative reasons. So expenditure is now rather messier, but I do the same process of saying, let's start do the subtractions. W goes consumption out of profits, speculation out of profits, retained earnings. You've got the same basic relationship. Now extended to include a different type of source of debt. Of course, positive during a boom, but negative during a crisis, which is what we're caught up in now. So the government, the final stage of this, it's too complicated to do it with, I'm going to try one day to see if I can actually break it down properly, the same identity approach with the international trade, but it got horrific, so I stopped at a certain point. This is just to emphasise the point that, again, Scott used the same chart a while ago, that there's the aggregate debt data we're talking about. This is serious. This is a debt level greater than the Great Depression. If debt matters, given how long it took us to go out of the Great Depression, back down to here again, we face an incredible pressure out of this, so this stuff seriously matters. Government, on the other hand, is fairly trivial and a reaction. When you include government in there, the government finance, if it has a deficit, then it's going to run up debt. So you can say the difference between government spending and government tax revenues is the change in government debt, of course not owed to the same entity to which we owe private debt. So you can ultimately argue that there's expenditure including the change in government debt. You do subtraction and you get the gap between expenditure and income representing all three types of changes of debt. And of course foreign debt would make it more complicated again. So I think it gives you a different policy conclusion, at least a different emphasis on how successful it can be. Yes, government spending can attenuate a downturn, but of course if you have an increase in government spending, it can be counteracted by the level of private sector deleveraging. But since the debt should never have been created in the first place, we should be abolishing part of that debt. The whole idea of a moratorium, which Michael was talking about earlier, is necessary to get out of this crisis. And it's also important to make sure that that government debt doesn't support a Ponzi scheme by the financial sector. Yeah.
So is this like the similar conclusion that last Tuesday, what happened to prevent profits from going to negative infinity, government spending would keep on growing as the debts would grow along with it. Just trying to maintain that cap.
Yeah. You don't have a necessary. You don't drive private sector debt down by running a government deficit necessarily, because they can independently increase it by borrowing from the private banks. So you've got to be cognizant of the independence in that sense. They're related, but they're not linked in a rigid way. Okay? So if you're going to run a government deficit and you pump money into the economy, yes, it could mean the private sector can reduce its debt level, but it might increase them by using that plus extra money to speculate with, borrowed from the private banking sector. So we have to get rid of the Ponzi finance effect. As a matter,
I just say, I think you're saying the same thing, you just got there a different way. And showed various.
Yeah, I think we
showed a very interesting angle on.
Yeah, and for mathematicians, what it means in terms of how you look at the system, if you read the original MMT literature, you would have seen a conservative system. And this is getting a dissipative system, which changes the characteristics quite dramatically. So, having had MMT focused on government money creation, and I focused on private money creation, because we need an integrated model. So what I'm going to do first of all is go through a parsimonious model, and this is the one which generally MMT has been using and been criticised for saying it's not complete. But what I'll show you is that it's actually consistent with the next level, but there is an additional complication that comes in. So the central bank lends to Treasury, and banks lend to the non-bank public. I'm being incredibly simplistic here, not looking at much of the structure at all, and seeing what comes out of starting at that level. And of course, the idea is to start at that level and then add the complications as you go further on. So here's a quote from Scott's paper in the Perry debate. So government spending credits bank accounts with high-powered money. Their liabilities to the government central bank, and the banks then credit the deposit accounts of the recipients. So and therefore you've got an increase in reserve balances which increase assets and liabilities of the private banking sector at the same time. And then you've got this one about net wealth credit. I'm not particularly worried about that. That's to me, I want to change that one as an emphasis in the debate. Okay.
I'll just say that's the broad paradigm description. That is the strong form I was showing. What you have up there is the strong form I was showing. I wouldn't say that that's.
No. It's
the details of an actual.
We start from that level and move on to a fuller model. So doing the modelling of that, I realised that when trying to work it out, I needed 5 accounts to be consistent with what you have to do with double entry bookkeeping. And Matthias and I are having a debate over this one, where they actually need the pluses, the minus either side. I think you're probably right, mate, but it's a question of telling you where the pluses have to go. That's the hard bit. So the assets in this. Oh.
What'd you say?
Okay. Another mathematician joke.
Oh, well, those are always funny.
Okay. So central bank has to have a charter to be able to produce money. A loan account, I had to have, rather than amalgamating the whole thing, I found I had to have a separate loan account for the Treasury to make the whole thing hold together in double entry bookkeeping terms. Its liabilities were a vault, so having the right to create the money, which is the asset, the money it creates is the liability. Okay? Dollar notes are a liability of the government. A deposit account which is matching the loan account for anything it lends to Treasury, and then the reserve accounts which link it to the private banking sector. And the private banks, again, the minimum to get this particular model of money creation, I needed to have reserve account, of course, that's the same account as in the central bank system. Loans to the public by the private banking sector. and those are its assets, and its liabilities are deposits for the private banking, not the non-bank private sector. And I had equity there as well, just to complete the whole equation, because obviously private banks have equity, but it doesn't play any role in this particular model. What you get out of it are two systems that are entwined with each other. So these are two tables done in MathCAD. I'll talk a bit more about that later. Where I start off by saying there's this intangible asset, which is the right to create the money of a country, the sovereign right. And that as an asset is matched by a liability on the other side with a negative sign, so the sum of the initial values is zero. Then I have the government governs government spending, taxes government taxation. So the government spending mechanism starts with the bank getting a loan from the central bank. So with accounting parlance, and I know this is weird for me to get used to first time around too, is that when you have an increase in liabilities, it's shown in a negative sign in double entry bookkeeping. An increase in assets is shown with a positive sign. So what I'm showing here, that is a flow from the vault to the treasury deposit. Over here, the accounting of that is done because now you're talking, there's on the asset side, the positive is an increase. So the loan has gone up, and in a sense, the value of the asset has gone down to match each other out, because you're talking about an asset with undefined values, so you're not decrementing anything in any way. That's that transaction. Then finally, when you spend, what is actually going on is the government is transferring money from its account down to the liabilities, down to the deposit accounts of welfare recipients, people that's buying goods off, that sort of thing. But to do that, the money has to be put into the assets of the private bank as well. So those three operations are all linked to each other. So the first thing, you have the treasury borrowing, and then it being recorded, which takes 4 entries in that table. And then the actual spending of it involves those 2 entries in one table, 2 in another. So to make the whole thing hold together, I need 8 places where government spending turns up in the system. I'm making that point now because imagine trying to wire that up in a systems dynamics diagram. Taxation, the reverse direction. And the Treasury then repays the debt. So again, 8 entries. That all makes sense? Okay. Then the final bit of the operation is public borrowing from the banks themselves. So there's a loan from the banks to the public, and then the public repays those loans, going the opposite direction. The whole thing sits together. Now, what I can get out of that is a system that explains creation of both sorts of money, government and private sector money at one time, and it also gets to the argument that aggregate demand equals income plus change in debt. Not actually aggregate demand here, but the stock of money in the economy. Okay. These two things are related to each other. So what I'm not talking about now is the stock of money. Income is the turnover, the result of turnover of that money over time. This is the stock of money in circulation. So what I've got now is money in circulation equals the initial amount where you start from plus the change in debt.
And your money in circulation is government money and bank
government.
money. Yeah. And the government is not issuing securities in the model.
No securities
at
at all.
all. So that's why you have those two.
Yeah, securities come in later.
I'm just clarifying.
Okay, so what I've got, the public deposit account. This is the public deposits of the public sector, the private sector. Sorry, deposits of the public in the private banks. That is the actual money supply that's turning over. And what you'll notice is that the change in that is government spending minus taxation, plus new loans minus repayment of loans. So both sectors are contributing to the amount of money in circulation. That's the growth of the money in circulation. Follow that?
Yes.
Okay. So it can now grow into several conditions. It's going to grow when the government spending exceeds taxation, which is deficit finance, but also grows when private sector lending exceeds repayment. There's 2 forces that can make the amount of money in the economy increase. Now, when I extend the model, because that was very, very simplified, I didn't have anything done with the money apart from blending it and repaying it again. Of course, what's going to happen is there's going to be wages being paid. Well, that's a transfer from one sort of liabilities of the banking sector to another sort of liabilities. That's the sort of thing that Paul Krugman thinks of lending. Okay. But it's not, that's payment, that's the income, as you were saying earlier. Okay. So it has no impact on the bank. The bank doesn't need to worry about that. That's just transferring where its liabilities are stored in one account versus another. But this is one other thing I want the MMT to move toward when we're doing it now, which is great. Disaggregating the private sector. Certainly taking the banking sector separate from the non-bank, and then breaking the non-bank down into the different components so you can actually look at the overall social and financial dynamics. So I've got wage payments going on there, dividends being paid by the firms, interest being paid or charged on the bank and then paid to the bank, so the bank's making money out of the operation, consumption by all these social classes from the firm sector, etc., etc. So out of that you can build a dynamic model. At that stage, a very simple one. Hang on, I've got the animation completely screwed up here, pardon me. Okay, yeah, what have I got to say? Yeah, so, and what you find, the changes in the amount of money in circulation is exactly the same with the change in the levels of debt. That all ties together. Pardon that fairly bad animation there. Okay. Now what that means is, of course, the government deficit can offset what the private sector is doing in terms of deleveraging. And that therefore means you get less impact out of the deficit than you would like to get. You've got to address them two together. This is showing what's happening with private debt going down. You can notice how sharp the decline in private debt was. It's since flattened out. But the rise in public debt, more gradual. That should have had more. That would have had much more bang for its buck if this hadn't happened. But this has to happen. I agree with Paul on this front as well. You have to have the public sector, the private sector deleveraging, because there's far too much debt out there. Now, what I'm trying to do now is combine these two, generalise the MMT model of government money creation to include the practice that is actually enforced upon the American government and many, many others, that the government can't borrow directly from Treasury. It has to instead sell bonds to bond, what do they call them, bond dealers? Bond dealers. And then getting the money from selling the bonds to the bond dealers, then it can finance its deficit. So we're all aware about that. This is quoting from Scott's and Stephanie's and Randy's paper about it as well, saying why they prefer to consolidate. But it is actually possible to bring them together. Isn't it the right framework to do it? So I have the government now selling bonds to bond dealers, and the central bank, at its own discretion, treating the fact it is independent, whether it should or shouldn't be, it can decide whether it does or doesn't buy bonds back from the dealers. And therefore the net buying of bonds is another factor that changes the amount of money in circulation once you generalise it that way. So here's a new model. Pardon the smallness of the text. I'm trying to fit 3 different tables on the one screen. But to start with here, if you follow the arrow, again what I've broken the government into the Treasury with a set of accounts and the central bank with a set of accounts, and the private sector banks as well. And the first stage is, as well as having, I've taken what I call the fiat license last time around, which is the right for the government in general to create a sovereign currency, saying, well, the Treasury has a right to issue bonds for government finance, okay? Which again is an undefined asset, matched by the undefined capacity to create those bonds, so you start again from zero at the initial conditions. Then the government will plan what to do. I've got deficit there, it could be a surplus, but that's to show that there's, again, an accounting identity between what you plan to spend, changing your license and increasing your bonds. And that's once this is the asset. There's only one asset in that table, which is that right. Everything else is a liability. So you notice that I'm using the minus on the liability side to show that there's an increase in the deficit there. Once that decision's been made, with this cursor come back, the bank then sells the bonds to the dealers. Now that, of course, has a similar operation over here, where the liabilities, the central bank is then increasing its liabilities. Hang on, I'm getting caught up in trying to read the damn thing. Let's give it a try. Okay. The final, I'd follow my own time trying to go through that stuff on screen live. But what you get down to is the operation that actually determines whether there's actually money created out of this is the central bank's buying of bonds off the dealers. Because when the government sells a bond to the bond dealers and gets money back, it's getting money out of the existing stock of money. It's not got the capacity to spend that it didn't have before selling the bonds, but it's got money that it's taken out of the system. So for that thing of being more money, the central bank has to buy some of those bonds back off the dealers, and that then means the central bank transfers spending power to the dealers additional to what within the economy before the bonds were created.
You create money.
You create money.
I wouldn't say necessarily spending.
Oh yeah, create money. Okay. So you've now got to track the type of account as well, by the way. I'm generalising the system as I develop the analysis further. So I'm keeping track of the fact that the license is effectively an entry in a ledger. There's bonds as well, which is another form of asset, and there's money again, another form of asset. So it's important to keep track of all those and looking at the overall dynamics. Now, what comes out of that, this is the change in circulation. Looking at the non-bank public's amount of money, what the bond dealers have, how that changes. Nothing happening in bank equity just yet. The sum of all the three now has these 6 terms. What you're saying, change of money in circulation is now the government deficit, plus new lending, plus net central bank bond buying. Now, of course, they can all go in opposite directions with each other.
Can I add one?
Yeah, sure.
Right there. You said that the central bank can do this via discretion.
Yeah.
Which I like that. Because the discretion is in its choice of how to manage the interest rate target.
Yeah, its behaviour there would be related to whether it believes the interest rate's rising or falling. I didn't actually do this.
Well, I mean the method of doing it. So for instance, like right now, we pay interest on reserves at the target.
Yeah.
If we do that, we can have as many reserves out there as we want.
Yeah.
But if we pay, if the interest rate target is above the interest rate we pay on reserves, then we have to accommodate banks and whatever they want. But we can choose as a central bank which one we want.
Yeah.
So there's the
So
discretion.
this is actually now a mechanism to say, let's bring in the behaviour of the central bank as being an organisation trying to target a base interest rate. And then you can include that in the model as well.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. So, but the interesting thing as well that I hadn't covered properly there, I've got to go back to, reserves aren't needed for lending, even if you show that you are lending from reserves. I'll go back and show that on that illustration in a moment. Yeah, because what I've got for the lending, hang on, is it there? I haven't shown it, it must be the next one, pardon me. I haven't done it, but actually when you do the accounting of lending, which I didn't show in that particular illustration, people think banks lend from reserves. Well, in double entry bookkeeping terms, this is where Matthias should be listening. Sorry, mate. I do exactly the same thing, but I can't help it.
I'm reading NEPA.
My God.
Everything you're saying, I'm checking.
He's a mathematician, he can multitask. Okay. If you're going to have lending from reserves, you've got to show reserves falling, which is a minus. Okay? You've got to match that on the other side with a liability that's a plus. But if you put a plus on the other side, you're saying you're actually reducing it. So what people think, yeah, double entry terms, the row has to sum to 0. If you're going to be lending from reserves, you've got a minus on your asset side. You've got to have a plus on your liability side. But if you have a plus on your liability side, you're actually reducing the amount of money there. So when you work it all through, what you have to have first of all is the bank has a minus on its reserves and a plus on its loans, balancing that particular row just on the asset side. And then the actual transfer is going to be a minus on the reserves and a plus on the reserves and a minus on the liabilities. That gives you the overall balance. What you get is the loan rises, and what you get is a plus loan on one row and a minus loan on the other in the liabilities of the private sector, which means they've got the money. So even if you say you pass it through reserves, you get the result that reserves have no impact on the lending. So reserves become a frictional thing. They're necessary for banks to settle their own internal accounts with each other. They're also necessary for the government to impact on the private sector, but they're not part of the lending process of the aggregate banking sector to the rest of the economy. So now what I'm going to go through now is how I do all this stuff. And this is because I'm delighted to share what I'm doing with an analytic approach with MMT, so we actually get a more general theory that can actually go beyond verbal explanations to tabular and mathematical that we can all analyse and follow properly. So this is a very simple model before I started doing double entry bookkeeping, where I had this is a private sector banking system only, with a firm loan account, deposit account, bank deposit, meaning the bank having like a safe, and worker deposit. This is just an example to illustrate what's going on. You notice I've got A, B, C and D, in the row there. Well, I feed that into a ludicrously simple program. I used to do this stuff by hand. And then one day, you know what mathematicians are like, obviously. You do something twice, you're bored. You want to find a way of automating it. So, in about 3 minutes, I wrote that program. That's only because I'm a slow typist. And it returns a system of ordinary differential equations, symbolically. So what's actually going on is the equation, first of all, says, there are my functions. There are the equations. For each column in those equations, sum the entries and make them equal to the differential of the function, and that returns the argument over there. All there is to it. So that's the technique behind building my dynamic models. And then what I do is I substitute functions for those simple placeholders, A, B, C, D, E. Again, of course, you can do this in any other program. This is the larger system where I've got bank equity, bank transactions, again, badly laid out before I started getting into double entry bookkeeping. But I then make those substitutions. There are A to L entries over here, and I then feed in all these various functions. So, for example, the fourth one there, D, which we'll come to in a moment, is wages. So there's D for wages. There's what I substituted through in this table. So the program takes that and it turns up in 2 locations and generates that entry in that particular row and that one as well. So once I've got the table right, I know that the equations are correct. There's no problem about having to check whether the differential equations are properly stated. And I've got that doing there. Okay, they're all disappearing one by one. Go away. Come on. Bang, bang. Okay. Now having done that, a bit of kludging is necessary because what MathCAD returns to me is this particular matrix. Now, another program like Mathematica, which I've also had this developed in by my colleague Mike Honeychurch, doesn't have to go through this stage, but there's no way around it. I simply had to go through and kludge it by hand cutting it. So what I've got to do is copy and paste. This is for your info stock for later usage. Copy and paste. Get the bloody equations out of the matrix, and then I keep on going from there. And what I can then do is I paste it onto the palette that it uses and put it inside what's called a given block. So the word given at the top, followed by ODE solved down the bottom, tells MathCAD there's a system of differential equations that it has to solve. So some of those equations there are for modelling physical flows, which I had to work out, again, independent of the table. That's the good model I've shown you beforehand. If you then simulate it with a little statement to simulate, where you state the variables, and this again is a little warning to you, Scott, from doing it. I'd have to define the equation with brackets T. When I feed it to ODE solve, I can't put it in the brackets T. One of the little awkward things about how the program's set up. Okay.
You're going to get emails from me.
Yeah. Now what you then get, I can simulate, that's a particular system where I show what happens when a credit crunch occurs for bank accounts and so on. Or you can analyse, as I've been doing symbolically so far. Now, of course, you could do that in any symbolic math algebra program, so Mathematica, Maple. Did MATLAB have much of the way of symbolics to it?
Yeah.
Okay, good, you can do it there as well. But I'm doing this to overcome the nerd barrier. We're all nerds, we enjoy this sort of stuff, like differential equations and so on. Now, I could have tried doing it, and I did try to do it initially in systems engineering programs, and the frustration of working with those was immense because the social sciences are used to them. They've got, in engineering, you've got Simulink and VisSim and stuff like that as well. But you get spaghetti code. If you try to put together a flow like that, that's pretty much the best you can get. I'm trying to work out where the hell does debt repayment go, That looks like it's arrow there, I think. And whether you wire it up properly, you don't necessarily connect it properly. So the table helps immensely. So what I've done with an INET grant is start developing a program called Minsky, which embeds a table into a palette, because you still need that palette for modelling financial flows. So this is just a quick look at the beta of it, which is now available. So you have an account, a bank icon you can create, and you then have the accounts I've shown you a moment ago, and Minsky automatically maintains the balances for you to show you whether it's possible, whether you actually have the right balances. You can have multiple banks inside there. I haven't allowed multiple views of the accounts of one bank, but that will happen. So if you now go to my website, you can download a demo, well, not a demo, a beta version of Minsky, install it. It's a open source. So, and there's versions for Macs as well as PCs on there, and if you're a Linux person, you can compile it yourself, because you're nerds, okay? No problem. So, okay, so here what you get is a palette like so. You can build a standard systems engineering program in it with only one level of grouping so far. That's one of the most important things we have to add to it. But click on the bank icon, there's your bank, double click on it, you then get a table, like what I've been showing you in MathCAD, and let's just make it a bit larger here. And you then can define your variables. So if I call this, for example, this is so, I'll go to my simple little system saying that the bank's got a vault, which is one of its assets, with the initial $100 in it. Notice the row sum here will change to 100. Then add another column, which I'm going to call also an asset, which are going to be loans. And I'm then going to have over here another, which is now a liability, and I'll make this the firms, the firm deposits, and I'm going to make that initial loan of 100 to the firm sector, and now the row sum goes to 0. So it's doing the accounting for you, whether that's numerically or symbolically. So I now show an operation here. Let's say I add in lending money. And I'm going to show that as a transfer, first of all, of minus a loan from here. I'm going to make this a bit silly. I'm not going to be careful about it. So you always make a mistake in doing a demo live anyway. Whacking the money straight across to, that's a minus loan there. Pardon me. No, what am I doing wrong? Let's go back here again. Discipline, double entry bookkeeping. I'm going to have plus loan here, which means you've got to have minus loan over here. That's summing to 0. And then you continue the operation. It's still the same operation, effectively. Then you're going to have minus loan over here, and you're going to have plus loan back over here. And that also is, oh, I've got an underscore there, let's get rid of that. Okay, so you know you've got your operations correct. It's going to do it for you all the way through. And then what you notice down here in the icon, that operation is now turned as an input to the system. So I can then right-click, copy it and paste it up here, right-click on that output up and paste it up here, and I then bring down a constant, which I prefer to work with time constant, so I'll just call this just the heck of a tau L. Tau meaning we're going to change it so we actually support Greek characters at some stage. Give it a value. Okay. Now I'll divide. Hang on. Click on the Y. We haven't made the context-sensitive clicking as yet, so I've just got to change your mode by clicking on Y. And you've now defined what the loan is. So that's trying to get past the nerd barrier and make it actually sexy to do this stuff. Whack in a system, you graph it, and so on, and away you go. And that's what I hope will be the very beginning of an engine for monetary macroeconomics, and get away from this nonsensical neoclassical crap of a capitalist system without banks and money in it. Let's see what I've got to here. I'm still on Minsky. Okay, that's it. Thank you. Okay.
You mentioned the need to overcome the nerd factor, right, towards the end. Would it help if you moved from differential equations to differential equations?
No, I don't believe it all. I think that being caught in difference equations is part of the problem. Because, obviously, just give me a second to save this, the presentation with the name. The problem about difference equations is that, first of all, if you know your difference equations and you make up a system based on them, where there is a variable that depends upon the value of another variable at the same time, you get an algebraic loop. So to breach it, you've got to bring in another time lag. So you get people forcing artificial time lags in relation that don't actually exist to make the system soluble. And then, even though, like if, for example, if I'm going to model red crab populations on Christmas Island, then I'd be quite happy at saying the population of red crabs being born in 2000, year T is 150 times what the population was in year T minus 1. Not a problem. Then I have the death rate being a similar sort of thing. Because they are born on the same, they do get spawned on the same day. There's a way of avoiding predators. But if I say that investment is based on changes in output the previous 2 years, I'm pretending that everybody in the industry economy is investing on the same day. No, they're not. It's discontinuous, asynchronous behaviour. So what you're far better to model that as continuous time. And then when you're modelling continuous time, you'll use time constants and varying time constants as your way of linking one system state to another. So if you start with, say, 7 equations of the sinus system, you'll have 7 or more time constants turning up there, and you'll just analyse the dynamics of those. But if you have a difference equation and you start with a particular time lag worked out for investment, let's say you work out the investment time lag is roughly 103 weeks. Okay. You're going to have T, you're going to have T minus 103. But then you find it's wrong. We've got to go T minus 104. You've got to, difference equations are partly what have led economics into the impasse it's in right now. So I want to move people from difference equations to differential.
Yeah, that's the point that I didn't understand. You said that that the part of the problem is discrete time. But I mean, if you make the time step small enough, that's close enough to the differential equation.
But it's more what happens in the mind than the time step, because if you actually, yes, you can work in discrete units, then you can do it very, very closely. If you have your time units being a millionth of a second. But the Runge-Cutter algorithm's doing that anyway. And we know that that's what's actually happening to turn the simulation into a discrete time simulation of a continuous time system. So let's leave that for the computer. The trouble is, if you read a lot of the literature by post-Keynesian economists, they get quite caught in this whole thing, what they call period analysis. And they're trying to work out when things happen. And Giuseppe Fontana, isn't it? I get Fontana and Fonseca mixed up. Giuseppe from Leeds. Okay. Giuseppe has a great paper where he's trying to go through, trying to bring together structuralist versus horizontalist views of endogenous money, and concludes that everything interesting happens between the time periods. It gets caught in the mental dilemma that all the change has to occur when you're not in a period, which means all the interesting stuff slips through the crack, and that's why they got stuck for 20 years, not being able to work out how monetary profits are created. So continuous time is more for the mind than the actual simulation system.
And they probably never met for 3 days like we just did either.
Pardon?
They probably never met for 3 days like we did either. So
Yeah,
so
true.
20 years just kept going.
Yeah.
Can I add one thing to
Yeah.
that? One of the things, when you presented this in 06, that came to me, maybe you were the one that said it, maybe that's why it came to me, but if you're ever going to build a really complex model of the macroeconomy and all the expectations that go in and so forth, we know that the data on the economy comes out at irregular intervals. That's all being fed into that. And that would be a much easier thing to put into this second model.
Yeah.
I mean, if you were ever going to put in, unemployment, unemployment claims come out weekly, and unemployment comes out monthly, and
etc. And quarterly data on GDP, etc. etc. Here's just have it. You then take the data and you know it's actually just snippets of a continuous time process. So you feed your data through that and then match it into this sort of system. Yeah, Richard.
So I really like the software, like the visualization that you're doing with that.
Yeah.
But my question is, can you program that in a way that, when you put in a loan flow, you put in the opposite loan flow simultaneously for another model from the person taking out the loan, and so it comes up, they both come up, and you can build these structural, everything that has a correlation, you can make it so that when you put that thing in that flow model, it comes up with the other parts in the flow.
Yeah.
So that way, you might see something that you might not have seen before.
Yeah, well, I mean, what I see coming out of this, again, the logic is important. So at the moment, the program only returns numerical answers. We're going to extend it so it actually generates your model in tech and shows you the equations and the correlations and what happened to deposits, etc. You see causal links that you wouldn't otherwise have seen. So like when I started doing the modelling of the more complete model of how the government actually finances itself by selling bonds to bond dealers, I did not expect to see a relation came out which gave me the selling and buying of the central bank actually turning up in there. I thought it was still the government minus tax. I didn't expect it. Because I wasn't trying to model the central bank's own behaviour, but trying to control the interest rate by manipulating reserve levels. Now I've got it in there. So you can see insights out of this that you wouldn't otherwise see.
So the visualization of putting those flows in and out, it sort of forces you to put the opposite flow.
Well, you have to, because that's the whole idea of double entry bookkeeping.
Yeah.
Scott has probably more experience in this, well, definitely more experience in this than I do. We actually still have to work out this thing about the positives and positive, because your point is you reckon it's just an accounting identity.
Just forget it.
But we'll get there later, over a beer in Sydney.
Do plus and minuses, no problem.
Yeah.
Do we need to open some of those blinds for the camera?
Yeah, a bit of light inside here now, because we don't need the cover anymore.
But we're done now.
Yeah, pretty much.
Can I just say for the audio, just because we talked about yesterday, people that really know accounting are going to be thrown off a bit by the framework. But what's happening is you're showing us what's coming up in MathCAD.
Yeah.
And it's the fact that we are using the differential equations that requires you to put the Stockian flow in there the way that you've done it. It's still consistent with accounting, but you have to do what the program requires you to do something that's consistent with the accounting. So people who know accounting very well shouldn't look at it and freak out immediately. They should look carefully and understand that the accounting is still consistent.
Okay.
I just wanted to say that for the audio.
Yeah. Yeah. Because that's just the beginning. That is like building a skeleton. The turning the system into having muscles on the bones and so on is going to be adding behavioural relations and feeding the overall dynamic, which I've done in various models beforehand, but I haven't yet done one which combines the government behaviour with the private sector behaviour. That's the next stage of work. Yeah?
Can you describe more intuitively what you're actually doing when you solve the model? Like, what are you taking as input or data to it? And then what are you generating as the output?
What you've got happening is, let's bring it up here. So, this is MathCAD. I'll bring up one of the working files here. Let's see. Okay. What you've got is a system of equations. That are, have you done differential equations? Okay. Which you then have. You then do. We'll show the differential equations here. You get a set of equations like that there. I think it's larger, a bit easier to read. So your inputs are a symbolic system. There's this equation for the rate of change of bank equity, rate of change of bank transactions, firm loans, firm deposits, worker deposits. All a set of equations.
All derived from the matrix of
accounting
relationships through the banking system and everything else.
And this handles any scale. One of the reasons that I'm very pleased about this framework, the way of doing the modelling, is that I've actually used it to model a 4-sectoral model of the economy quite easily. You can handle up to 1,000 sectors. It just expands. You can handle multiple countries as well. So to me, it's a feasible framework, a bit like what the Lorenz equations ultimately became for meteorology, a framework for doing monetary modelling on a global scale. But this is just very simple little model here. But then having done that, I then feed in a set of equations. So I have a generalised exponential function that I use for things like a Phillips curve relationship and so on. Feed in parameters for the various constants and variable states. So what I'm doing in this particular model is, for example, is saying if you're going to try to simulate the economy after it's hit a credit crunch, and the credit crunch is just where, for some reason, not a debt crisis, but for some reason, banks and everybody becomes more conservative about debt, so banks lend half as quickly, firms repay twice as quickly, that sort of thing. If that hit the economy, what would its impact be, and what would be the best way of directing it? Should you then put money into the vaults of the banks, which is more direct, and they can't lend out of a vault, so you put it into a vault, or you give it to the debtors, which one works better? Now, the advice that Obama followed, which is conventional neoclassical advice, said put it in the reserves, the banks will lend from the reserve, which we know they can't do, and that'll help the whole system. Very little effect. In Australia, I've got my country credit here, Ken Henry, who was then head of the Treasury, when asked by Rudd what you should do, he said, lovely little phrase, go hard, go early, go households. So I said, well, let's compare the two policies. They're exactly the same economy. What you want to do is inject $100 million or $100 billion, whatever way to think about it, into this economy, either into the vaults or into the deposit accounts. So this little function here is a pulse function. at the value of 100 for a year, and that therefore means for that particular year that amount of money is injected into the system from outside. This is before I could model the government as well. Now if you want to try modelling this as government rescue as well. And then feed in a set of initial conditions. So you've got to have initial conditions for your system. I've got wages inside here and labour and so on as well. And then the system which is solved by MathCAD is this whole region here. So there's a given, the words given, a differential equation for prices, labour productivity, population, the level of employment, the level of output, rate of change of wages. This is just redundant, but it's there so I can pull it out, the employment rate. Then I have the banking sector down here, so it's about a 14 equation system. And then that goes into a numerical simulator in MathCAD, which uses whichever algorithm works best. So there's a whole range of algorithms to simulate, a bit like the Taylor series approximation, but higher order. I think the Runge cutter is the most well known. There's Gaussler and a couple of other algorithms there. So I feed these are the system states. So that's bank equity, bank transactions, firm loan, firm deposits, worker deposits, price level, labour productivity, labour, output, population, employment rate, and wage level.
Those are the variables that solve it.
It solves for those variables, given initial conditions. And one beautiful thing about, I'll just illustrate this. Let's say, for example, in typing my Greek characters, I forgot to make that tau, I made a T instead. This is where MathCAD's much better than Mathematica, which Mathematica is far more powerful, but if I had an error like that in Mathematica, I would get a 30-page output of all the machine code errors I'd made. MathCAD instead turns red. You right-click on it, and it says trace error. Close, and there you are. Oh, Greek. Solved. So that's why I prefer MathCAD. It's, for human beings, it's much better. If I was a computer, I'd use Mathematica.
But let me get a crack at Jim's question in a different way. So the system is the engine that is solving something, but looking from the outside, what are the inputs and what are the outputs? So say, like neoclassical economists would say, the inputs are the utilities and the endowments, and what you get out. So those are the primitives of the model, and the technology, and what you get out are the allocations and prices. That's what. And then in the middle, there's the whole system of how to reach the equilibrium. So the way I see this is, you still have primitives, but the primitives are how workers bargain for wages, how the capitalists capitalists decide on investment given profit, and how the government decides on spending given the level of employment. Those are the primitives, which are very different from individual utilities.
There's also some behavioral primitives, though, about the lending and borrowing.
No. That's what I said in terms of how the capitalists invest, because that depends on how much they're going to be borrowing, what they want to borrow based on the profits that they're making. So the primitives, again, is how the workers will bargain for their wages. That's in the Phillips curve. How the capitalists decide on invest, depending on profits, and how the government reacts to employment. You put it in, crank the engine, and what you get out is the level of wages, the level of employment, and the level of output.
I should hire this guy.
That is the equilibrium.
After he's hired,
Sorry, that is the what?
Output is the equilibrium level.
No. The output doesn't need to be the equilibrium. The output is just the output that you see given the level of employment and productivity and the investment and so on.
This model is one where I've got constant parameters for investment behaviour and stuff like that. When I generalise it to saying investment depends upon the rate of profit, then I get a model of the Great Moderation followed by the Great Recession. So, it's
Do you have, can I see where you have investment modeled in? Can you show me how the investment is modeled there?
Yeah, this is very simple. I've just got there's a constant flow of money out of the banks. If I bring in a more advanced model than that, give me a second if I can find one. Hang on a sec. What are my university pages there? Let's see. this one is sitting in the bowels of GBO with this is a wrong set of initial conditions in this model. I've actually got algebraic initial conditions as well. There's a clash between a couple of them, so it generates very volatile opening systems. I've changed that later. But let's come down and find the graph of how I model investment behaviour. I've got these basic behavioural relations there. I'll just make this one, bring it up so you can see them all. So I basically use a simple exponential relationship between the two to say that capitalist investment as a percentage of GDP depends upon the rate of profit.
But then the investment goes into what account?
Oh, the investment then means they get a loan from the banking sector that goes into the firm's deposit account. And now the firm's deposit, what they're doing with that is effectively buying capital goods. Yeah. But I've generalised, again, like in a larger version of the multi-sectoral model, I've got them, each firm sector will borrow money depending upon its own rate of profit, and given that own rate of profit, it then buys capital goods from the capital goods sector. So I've got that disaggregated at that level as well.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Because I remember reading on your blog,
yeah,
on the firm's sector or the firm's deposit or loan account, it would have the investment going in there.
Yeah.
But then it would go out only as wages or payment of interest.
Yeah.
And then I was thinking, so where are the capital assets there? So
well, that's when you have this is part of the hassle of that aggregation. So when you have an aggregate capitalist sector, if you actually do what can happen out of like matrix thinking, you think, well, everything in one particular sector buying from itself sums to zero. Okay. Well, that's a false abstraction from our modelling technique, because we talk about the capital goods sector. We're really talking about, a place making trams buying from a place making steel. So there still have to be a financial transfer between the two. So in terms of lending, if you're going to invest more than you earn, you've got to borrow money to do it. So in the aggregate, you're going to have an increase in the total debts of the corporate sector, even when you work with the abstraction of a single sector. That's part of what I've got with the investment occurring there. So because I said investment spending is retained earnings plus change in debt, then I've got the change in debt being an addition to whatever they've got out of retained earning they could also invest. There's implicit spending by the capitalists inside that sector. It took me a while to work out the mathematics of it, but it fell out ultimately. But when I went to the multi-sectoral model, then what I could do is say, well, there is a capital goods sector, and each of the other sectors like agriculture, energy, consumer goods will buy capital goods, and they've got to make a financial transfer to do it. But then I also tried another trick which was quite useful. I wanted to make every last thing a monetary transfer. So in each sector I broke it in two halves, and one half had to buy from the other. So when the capital goods sector itself wanted to invest, K1 had to buy from K2 and K2 bought from K1. So therefore I forced every last transaction in the economy to be monetary, which otherwise it would have collapsed out of existence. And that tended up being, I think, crucial. And in fact, I actually got that limit cycle I showed you in the have I shown the multi-sectoral model here before? I think I did very quickly.
The first lecture.
Yeah. So I've got that on my website. So it does finally turn up. You do a capital accumulation, you have the funds going out for capital accumulation as well as consumption. And what I've added in as well now is, and again, it's just another column. That's all you've got to do. I've now got shareholders. So as well as the firm earning profits, it then pays dividends, and then people can buy shares back from it and so on. So you just have to add additional columns to add in those particular financial operations.
Just on the one sector economy.
Yeah.
My first intuition was that the firm's loan account should be increased by an investment. The firm deposit account should not be affected by it, because investments should not be used to pay wages. It should be used on capital assets. I don't know how that would affect the model, but that's the first thing I thought when I saw it.
Yeah, well, what you actually got is the firm sector has a certain amount of money you can use for a range of purposes. It adds to that money by borrowing, therefore the loan goes up and the deposit goes up by the same amount, the overall expansion. And the beauty is finding people like Farmer and French 1999, where they confirm a relationship between investment and change in long-term debt at the aggregate level for the corporate sector. So what I'm doing actually is, in a sense, modelling empirical findings.
And you could model through the impact of changes in some of the behavioral parameters. For example, there's a choice embedded in there about how much of the profits to distribute versus how much to retain. And under financialization, more of it has been distributed under pressure from the shareholders to get more money.
And that turns up.
You can show how that would affect the dynamics.
Yeah, well, you weren't actually aware for that, Jim, so I was to bring up the multi-sectoral model, show it to you in a sec.
Or there's also an issue about investment in real capital versus investment in existing assets.
Yeah, well, that's that. I haven't actually modelled the asset investment yet. I've got the framework for it, but I haven't had a chance to put it together.
But and that's where you could show I'm sure you could show in that system the fragility of the system as those parameters became more financialized in essence.
Yeah, and that's
you
I've got.
You would go from hedge to speculative.
Yeah, this is the multi-sectoral model. And what that table, which I've gone horizontally here, what I'll do in Minsky when I implement it is each sector will be another slice in a hypercube. But at the moment I've got as a single sector, and then I expand it sideways. So I've got, just to show you that this is scaled up so you can see more clearly there. I've got, my table now has K1 and K2, which are two halves of the capital goods sector. That's loans to capital goods 1, loans to capital 2, consumer goods, agriculture, energy, notionally, and then all the transactions are matched from 2 to 1 to force them all to be financial. So I've gone sideways and made it a larger two-dimensional table. But the realistic way to go is to say, well, when you've got a single dimension, like a two-dimensional table, then that's a aggregated, corn economy model. When you want to go to a multiple sector, you make it 3 dimensions. Okay. And then that's the three-dimensional cube now to have a multi-sectoral system. When you go to looking at multiple banks, you go for a 4th dimension, a hypercube. That's the design intention for Minsky as it goes on. But to show you the dynamics of this, it's a monster bloody model. Page down a bit. You'll see some of the equations that go past later on. Let's see. These are the relationships here, Jim, just to talk about behaviour changing. At a simple level, I've got a Phillips curve relationship for wages, investment being a function of the rate of profit. This will turn up in a second. And they're basically simple exponentials, so there's no, I haven't got any curves, and there's no sigmoidal relationship there to make things taper off. So you've got a whole set of functions which all go to infinity, effectively, if their driving factor goes in the same direction. There's 5 variables. So behaviour is changing, but I've got fixed parameters dividing the function. You could add in, variable parameters as well. You can go at least one level of complexity deeper than that. So one thing I'd like to do...
Just do a comparative static type analysis once you
change
the parameter.
Or
comparative time path analysis.
Well, what you do is you just do a hyperspace exploration, like Matthias has done, and cover every last parameter value and see what your basins of stability are, and the ultimate of exponents and so on. Let's go down here. So the system is a monster. There's 41 differential equations in it. And I'll bring it the part that I most like, because one thing which you'll find in the literature of economics is that the shape of the business cycle is like a sawtooth. It's not a sine wave. It's not even like straight up and straight down. It's got like the shape that the sawtooth has. And that's when I simulate it, and I then aggregate using a price index for all the different sectors to get the aggregate level of output, and take out inflation as well as I've got real GDP change. Tick, 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 tick. That's over the long term, and this is a single cycle. So, in a sense, describing the structure of the economy properly, financial as well as physical, generates the stylized fact that we've seen in the real economy as well. And what I've got as well is, in terms of rates of profit and stuff like that, varying rates of profit over time, different sectors too. So that, to me, the technology scales all the way to being a potential way of modelling an entire global monetary, financial and physical system. But I'm just a bit pushy, so what would I know?
Good.
Yeah.
Sorry, just quickly, following on Jim's question, what's your hope ultimately for this model? Because we've seen lots of examples in other fields, time machines and so forth, where models are very sophisticated, but they have various kinds of impact in real world.
Yeah.
So what do you hope or perhaps fear to see happen with these kind of models?
What I want to do is, first of all, take students away from thinking in static equilibrium neoclassical ways. So I want to make it sexy to do my stuff and regard neoclassical as boring and passé, which it is already, but these people get locked into playing the games of general equilibrium or DSGE modelling because it's difficult. It's difficult enough to be a challenge. I want to make it look so silly to model the economy that way that nobody bothers. So that's at the teaching level. And I'm hoping that over time, even though I know there's no chance of predicting the future, I want to have a model that characterises the behaviour of the system so it becomes an artificial economy. And you then fit it so it can give you financial crisis, which the system can. It can give you systems of stability as well. You can test out different policies and have a virtual economy into which you trial different policies and see what the impact is and get that feedback, because the great problem for policymakers is not their fault when they're listening to economists anyway, is that the model's just too complex. So they grab to the nearest comfortable analogy, and the easiest analogy for everybody is the world's like a household. And therefore austerity makes an immediate appeal to people, whereas if you model austerity in my system, you show the impact is to reduce GDP. Yeah.
But just for that analogy, the world is like a household. It would have to be there are other worlds that are doing good. And if we are austere, then sort of we can sort of gain money off that.
Yeah.
Because we're competing with the other worlds.
Yeah, we need to go shopping on Mars.
Or you're doing quantum mechanics as a many worlds approach.
They can interact, right?
Yeah.
If I understand the Minsky system that we are building now, right? We are building, you will be going on the screen some nodes and edges connecting them, so you will build some large data graph.
Yeah.
Right. So once you get there, you should also be able to identify interesting cycles in the graph. Right?
Oh yeah.
Is there one big cycle, or are there a lot of small cycles connected to? Those kinds of questions.
Yeah, and that's what what I expect to come out of it is a range of interlocking cycles, drifting cycles, getting locked in particular into black holes like a depression. Like Matthias's analysis of my simple Goodwin model pretty much argues you've got like an event horizon in debt, beyond which if you go past that event horizon, you get sucked into the black hole of infinite debt, that sort of thing. So, and then to say if you can avoid the event horizon, then you have a healthier economy. So our role is to try to avoid that event horizon. So that's, I expect to get quite complex cycles coming out of it. This is incredibly simple and still gives remarkable cycles. So it's adding other elements of reality, drifting in, for example, the government's line in which the government wants to stop unemployment rising. Back in the 1960s, if unemployment exceeded 3%, they'd panic. Now it hit 6%, they call it the natural rate of unemployment. So those sorts of changes you'd need to include, and then that would give you a model which drifted rather than being stuck in a particular limit cycle at a time.
There's something you said there that I sort of want to reemphasize is the models that the neoclassicals come up with. One of the ways that they test them is basically root mean squared errors out of sample, and they also test policies that way, right? And if the policy works better in more and more models, then it's more robust. And this is a different approach. This is let's understand the process.
Yeah.
Right. And that's going to be sort of the threshold that we have to cross to know if we have a good model and if we have a good policy.
Yeah.
And so that's so we're trying to change the way of thinking too.
But that doesn't mean that you can't do the empirical test.
You're still going to have to.
Yeah.
You're still going to have to, but it's a different way of thinking about what your point is.
Well, this concludes our wonderful series, 5 weeks. Steve's still going to give a public lecture on Thursday night if you're interested at 6 o'clock.
6 o'clock here?
6 or 5. Check the web, I don't remember.
Yeah. It says 5. It says 5.
5 o'clock.
It says 5, so it's 5. What do I know? and well, thank you, Steve and Scott.
Thank you. Thanks to Matthias for putting it all together, because it wouldn't have happened without him finding my research and pushing up further, and I'm delighted to be the building. I'll have to go back many times.
And I did order coffee.